extramarital relations in Rome, because this gets interesting. While marriage was monogamous, Roman men often engaged in other sexual relationships. Sexual activity with slaves, prostitutes, and women of lower status was socially acceptable for married men and not considered adultery under the law.
All right, guys, welcome back for part 2 of this fantastic video that we are reviewing, making some response to. When did Christians and Jews become monogamous? By Based Camp with Simone and Malcolm. So fantastic. Welcome back. Buckle up. Let's get the intro over. Okay, guys, I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate the opportunity to share, for us to learn and grow together. I would ask that if this is a ministry that you desire to support or encourage in any way, we would love to have you in our Patreon. Great way to fellowship with others, get some benefits, and be able to help us out a little bit with what we are doing. So hit that like, share, subscribe button. Sometimes I think that maybe we've been shadow banned, and if so, the best way to get the word out is for you to share a video or two, pick some pieces, parts, share them with friends, throw it up on Facebook, X, Insta, other media, whatever. We appreciate you passing along the word about what Scripture actually has to say about marriage, and we would love to be able to help others. So. Good t-shirt here. Got this from my friend Rob Kowalski. He sent this to me one point some time ago. Polygyny rocks. And so we are going to now return. We're going back to part 2 of the review of this video from Simone and Malcolm, Based Camp with Simone and Malcolm. When did Christians and Jews become monogamous? We're starting at about the 21-minute mark, and we're getting ready to dive into the Roman side. He has gone through all of Scripture and basically demonstrated from his study and understanding that God never condemns it. Never condemns it. So let's get ready and see what they have to say.
Extramarital relations in Rome, because this gets interesting. While marriage was monogamous, Roman men often engaged in other sexual relationships. Sexual activity with slaves, prostitutes, and women of lower status was socially acceptable for married men and not considered adultery under the law.
This explains a whole lot of what Paul was writing and why he was writing some of the things that he wrote to a number of the churches that he was, the ecclesias, the assemblies, because that's not the church. The use of the word church is typically misapplied or misunderstood in the way that the way that it gets translated in Scripture. The assemblies, right? So he's writing to the assemblies. And it's in the face of Roman law that allowed all sorts of promiscuity. But you could only have one wife.
Powerful men frequently had multiple sexual partners in addition to their wife, a practice sometimes called male resource polygyny. A man having a long-term unmarried female partner existed, though its prevalence and legal status in different periods is debated. So I should note here that in Rome, it wasn't like fully modern in its understanding of monogamy. It was a monogamous system where you had one real wife that produced heirs. But, you know, you would have sex with other women if you were a powerful man. In many ways, I might think that the Roman system is actually morally superior to our existing system in the West. Because
in what way? Just that it's less uptight, less brittle?
I would say that the Roman system is exactly what we currently have in the West. It's what we have out there right now. You go out there and take a look at what's going on out there. You've got people sleeping around. You've got all sorts of sex on the side. Men, women married, but that doesn't mean anything. They're swingers. They're doing, or they just simply divorce and move on to the next one. What we could call serial monogamy or serial polygyny. It's a form of polygyny where a man has multiple partners that he's committed to until he's not committed to them. What was going on in Rome, not what was going on in Israel. The height of Israel's polygynous culture, this sort of madness was not allowed. It was gross sin that resulted in stoning, that resulted in being cast out of the camp, out of the people. But in Rome, oh yeah, Rome, that's the height of civilization, and we've just got we just got all this sexual promiscuity. Ugh.
Yeah, it's less brittle because it's more honest.
Yeah.
As I've pointed out, when people are like, "Ooh, Christianity, we need to go back to the old ways and be monogamous," and I'm like, okay, like, what do you consider like old ways monogamous Christianity? And they're like, Catholicism, and I'm like, you mean like Louis the 15th? Like, what was Louis the? Who was
Louis
the
the
big one?
14th.
Louis the
Louis the
14th.
14th.
The height of the Catholic Empire in terms of its culture, in terms of its wealth, in terms of its technology, and the most powerful man had tons of concubines.
Well, and it's still seen as a classically French thing where any married couple, there will be dalliances. Of course, you have your mistress. Of course, you're seeing someone on the side. That's still a French trope. I don't know. It's one of those awkward things because Catholicism being pervasive in the country, and this is also an issue with Louis the 14th, is the church was constantly like threatening to not give him communion, threatening of this. And in France still, there's this constant thing of, well, it's not okay to do this, but at the same time, everyone knows you do.
But at the same
time,
and this is, I could go get my copy of Thera with Dr. Martin Madan, who wrote a little bit later than the 14th century period. But this is the problem with monogamy onlyism, is you're always going to have single, unattached women who become free radicals in the system, which then which then they're going to look for or find a way to be serviced by a man, to have their needs met, or even to get an heir or secure a husband, right? Whether by divorce or by being a mistress on the side and being provided for by the wealthy men in the town or the wealthy men in the county, or whatever the district is, right? The problem with monogamy onlyism is you're always going to have what they're describing right here as a French trope. And it happens in every culture, every time, every place. It goes on here. It's always been this way because women need protection and men are wired to desire to protect single women. Yeah. That's just, and many men are wired for variety and the ability to care for more than one woman. So there you go.
Like a very Catholic thing.
Yeah. So it's like, if you can't, when you guys control, like, literally this is like the height of your cultural influence on humanity, and this is still happening. Like, I'm not like, okay, well, clearly the system's not working. And you, as I point out, there's no such thing as a non-polygynous society. The question is just, where is the slider on how wealthy and powerful a man has to be allowed multiple wives without anyone blinking an eye?
Oh, so he makes a great point right here. There is no non-polygynous society. And that's true. There's no such thing. There never has been. It's just how they hide it, or where, as he says, they put the slider.
But you see, I think, pervasively in non-French-like societies or non-Roman style societies today, even, is now just serial monogamy, where, and in the end, men appear to have multiple wives, just not exactly at the same time, just one after another. Right. So I feel like, yes, the Roman system is better. It's less brutal. It's more honest. And I think a lot of relationships would be better off if men could just sleep with people on the side when they needed to, or maybe occasionally women too. It gets kind of complicated with that, but.
Or maybe God's law is righteous and perfect and true. And maybe his standard and the way he designed it to work from the jump is good. Maybe that's what we should consider, right? So these guys, I'm not 100% sure where they are. I think they're sort of somewhere with their feet between Christianity and Judaism, but trying to figure things out in some ways. And it's fascinating to me that that they don't stop and think, wait a minute, maybe God's way of doing things was right and just. And if so, then what we should do is just go back and say, what did he say? What did he allow or disallow? He disallowed flagrant divorce. He disallowed women from running around single. They were to be covered. He disallowed, he allowed for polygyny, right? But there's no requirement for polygyny. There's no requirement for there's no requirement for marriage anywhere, right? So he allows for men, depending on where they're wired, to seek to fill that need. And so all women have a potential place to be plugged into, whether it is a man that only has one wife or a man that has 2 or 3 or 4.
Like, if we were just open about it, instead of being like, no, it has to be in a marriage or one after another, or the marriage ends once the man sleeps with someone else, because that's not practical, it seems.
Yeah, well, I will say that this reading the Bible this way and understanding, I think, what is intended by the meta narrative of the evolution of monogamy within the church as a norm. That, I think, tells a deeper story about sort of the soul of Christianity and the true nature of Christianity that is missed if you ignore these lines or you attempt to misinterpret them to make your modern sexual mores look like they were the mores that were had at the time of various parts of the Bible being written, which hides from you, I think, a deeper and more interesting truth. So in some of our videos here, I talk about how my ancestors were savages until they were, and when I say savages, you know, I'm talking about like the ancient Celtic people of Britain, you know, killing children sacrificially and burying them under bridges to ensure that bridges stability. Like,
and he's true. He's telling the truth here, but it's also interesting to note that the Celts were polygynous, right? There's a whole fantastic discussion. Maybe I'll put a link to it down here if I can find the original discussion with regards to Celtic Christianity and Celtic polygyny.
Like savages, you know, evidence of human sacrifice at Stonehenge, like genuinely savage, monstrous, backwards people who didn't produce anything but mud huts. And I think we as a world are going to become more mature and get better able to deal with our differences and our histories when we can admit that most of us come from traditions. One of my favorite things is, and I often mention this when I'm bringing this up, somebody's like, we can tell he's a white nationalist because he named his kids Roman names. I'm like, the Romans colonized and conquered my people. That's like saying we can tell this person's a black nationalist because they gave their kids Victorian names. It's like, what? That makes no sense. But what they are showing, which is what is true, is that I look upon Rome, the seat of civilization at the time. And Rome did not invent civilization. Modern civilization evolved out of the Greek city-states.
All right, this is going to open into some very interesting territory as we begin to understand. He's going to unravel for us some of how we got here from there. And we're going to talk a little bit about Christianity being, this marriage between Rome and Scripture. And it is. It absolutely is. Christianity is a Greco-Roman religion.
I think that is the birthplace of civilization, which spread from there. It spread to the Romans. The Romans helped spread it around the world. The Britons then helped spread it around the world faster. And it was one of these things where it was a meme I saw once, and it was women looking towards their ancestors, and it was women looking at like of different ethnicities looking to ancestors of their ethnicity, and then it was men looking at their cultural ancestors. It was one of those superimposed things, was men of all the different ethnicities sort of overlapped, staring back at like Caesar, and it's like it's so true. You know, there's the famous quote like men think about Rome X many times per day or whatever, but I don't think that that's wrong. I think that Rome was one of the baton holders of civilization.
That is not just. It's law. Roman law.
Is there some other form of law? You wretched woman.
1,000 apologies.
And I don't think that, like, I don't glorify, for example, Rome over its successor states, whether that is Charlemagne or the Holy Roman Empire or the Victorian British Empire. But I will say that for a time, it definitely represented the core of civilizing force. And what Christianity represents is when Rome contacted the Jewish people. If you go to our tract 8, we go into a lot of the genuinely savage stuff that was happening in the temple, like ripping off doves' heads, then ripping them apart by their wings, sacrificing goats. Blood would have been running from it every day. When Jesus was flipping stuff over, it was the money sacrifices for buying like animal sacrifices to sacrifice at the temple.
True. And again, this is Yah's system. And ultimately, Scripture tells us, Ezekiel, that this will come back. Ezekiel 43 and 44 and beyond. And the prince, capital P, it's not capitalized in the Hebrew, but capital P, the prince who comes and goes, is Yeshua. So the millennial kingdom, and we can see other evidences as well. For example, in Zechariah chapter 14, verses 16 through 19 or 21, maybe it's through 21. Point being that sacrifice is coming back. I do a whole video about that, and it's something that's terribly challenging to Christian thought that thinks it's been done away with. It's only been suspended, right? But the big point the larger point that he's going to is that Christianity is a melding, is a marriage, is a syncretizing of Roman culture and Jewish law. And I'm telling you, he's right, and it's a tragedy because it's syncretism.
And we argue in that track that I think that that's actually a form of Baalite worship, and this is made very clear, and it wasn't ever meant to be done within the true religion. And I think what we see here is civilization crashing into a truly divinely inspired religion, creating something that is a merger of both of them, one in the form of Christianity, but also in the form of post-Second Temple Judaism. And this is where things get really spicy here, which is to say that, like everyone when they're first colonized, the Jewish people, and this was the people who, the king would have 700 wives. This was the people who, ripped apart animals and did all these animal sacrifices. This was the people who otherwise was fairly, they may have been more civilized than my ancestors when my ancestors first contacted civilization, but Rome was doing them a favor. It was bringing them into the era of civilization, and the Jewish people resisted, You
must guarantee, of course, to keep your Jews in line.
They will do as I say, or they will suffer the consequences.
Congratulations, then, Herod. You have the full backing of Rome.
And eventually, I believe that God used the Roman Empire to smash the temple for their incalcitrance, the other forms of really...
Some interesting thoughts here. But the first thing I would say is that God did use the Roman system to bring judgment against Judea and against the Jewish system, not because it wasn't following the Torah, not because it wasn't following the commandments correctly, but because they were not following the commandments correctly, and because they were embracing and placing their trust in other things besides Him. And so it was ongoing judgment for their disobedience, not for their obedience to what the Torah says. So what we end up having is we have the temple being destroyed, which effectively suspends what he had commanded. And the promise is that he will restore and bring that back, which so much of Christendom and so much of even Judaism would find very troubling when, if animal sacrifice were going on. In fact, if when we see this happen again in Jerusalem, and there may be a fake temple that happens first, okay? I'm not saying that the coming of a temple is the beginning of the next glowing civilization or whatever. There may be a fake that happens in between, and a false Messiah is brought forward, but the real Messiah is going to keep the commandments, and we know this. You go back and read Revelation chapter 20, where there will be 1,000-year reign. And in that 1,000 years, he's going to be obedient to the Torah, and he's going to keep the commandments of the Most High. And they will be done effectively in Jerusalem in the temple. Ezekiel chapter 43 and 44. Particularly pick up 44, starting at verse 15, and following, where it says that there will be the fat and the blood, etc., etc. But, again, he's making the point that that what we have today is effectively a marriage between Greco-Romanism, Greco-Roman culture, and Judaism, or parts of Judeo understanding of Scripture.
I'd almost say sort of tribal polytheistic worship that doesn't feel like part of like the one true religion. Helped them get out of this cycle of polygynous tribal culture and move into the civilized culture.
So this is one of the really big problems. Rome considered polygyny as barbaric, backwards. God didn't consider it as barbaric, backwards. Rome considered their governmental structure with the Senate and the representatives and, all of this stuff, the very thing that we have inherited in most Western democracies. They considered this to be civilized. God didn't. God actually uses polygynous tribal families as the foundation for his people. And in the future, the New Jerusalem will be named after the sons of a polygynist who had multiple wives. And everything that I understand in Scripture points to his people returning to his ways. And his ways, as expressed in Scripture, are clearly patriarchal, tribal culture with, polygyny as part of the equation. So one real problem I would have with him is him saying, but the height of civilization is Greco-Romanism. And that's the attitude of most of the church. And it's the attitude of most of Judaism. Because both of them married Greco-Romanism in order to keep peace and hold on to their people, right? And so the end result is this mishmash of syncretized religion. It's not what Scripture teaches. It's a religious system that's justified by pieces of Scripture. And it's, we see this here where he's talking about, you can go watch any Christian nationalist. You watch the rise of Christian nationalism, and they keep pointing to Rome and Western Europeanism. No, that's not the height of civilization. The height of civilization is the reign of Solomon, whether you understand or like. And in the last video, I talked a little bit about a possible different perspective on Solomon's 700 wives and 300 concubines. Possible different perspective. But the bottom line is, he's a picture. Solomon's an interesting enigma. He's a picture of the Messiah, peace, prosperity, a reign that may have covered a significant portion of the earth. And the other side is it may be a picture of the anti-Messiah, or the fact that a human can't do what the Messiah will do, right? Demonstrating that Solomon was incapable of doing what the Messiah will do in his reign. But God's civilization is not Greco-Romanism. Never was, never will be. And deifying or somehow elevating Greco-Romanism as the ideal is utterly false.
And this is where
just kind of by normatively rubbing off on them.
Yes, because Jews did move out of, and we'll get into a second how they moved out of polygyny as a cultural norm. That is obviously no longer a cultural norm in most forms of modern Judaism. And many Roman things are no longer cultural norms in modern Judaism.
Judaism is a religion. It's a religion that's based primarily on Talmud. We'll cover this more in a minute, and where they made that shift, or where they made some of these major shifts to get to modern Judaism. Christianity is a religion. It is not the belief that comes from Scripture or the apostles, and Judaism is not the belief or things that come from prior to the rabbinic additions and the rabbinic leaven and the rabbinic oral laws that Yeshua absolutely detested. Both of them should return to the root, which is the Torah, and Yeshua taught Torah properly, and ultimately he's the author of it.
And this is one of the areas where people see our show as being like overly phileo-Semitic. That means like overly pro-Jew. And we are very pro-Jew. Like I have respect for the modern Jewish people and the ancient Jewish people. But I would say that, you know, when I am reading literature, do I believe that time equivalent stories in the Old Testament versus ancient Greece, who was culturally more sophisticated? It was the ancient Greeks.
Yeah.
I'm just like civilization.
Yeah, completely disagree. If we're using the Greco-Roman lens, we would look at Greco-Romanism and go, oh, that was the height of civilization. The problem is Scripture hated the Greeks and hated, we could say that a little bit, it may be an anachronistic thing, but the Greeks were the ones that came in and slaughtered a pig in the temple, right? That's what the Maccabees were for, was to get rid of the Greeks. But Hellenism remained under the Romans, right? But if you go back again and look at the whole trajectory of the thing, it was because of Yah's judgment on Israel, on Judea, on the Jews, for not following his commands and instead getting into bed with the Greeks. They weren't the height of civilization, right?
Was more sophisticated, and that I think what allowed for the modern Jew to become what they are in this absolute powerhouse of a cultural tradition was the sort of smashing of the old temple, which freed the Jewish people from all of these ancient polytheistic like traditions and allowed them to evolve into the modern form of Judaism. But people could be like, oh, that's so anti-Semitic to say that point there. Like, how could you say that Judaism now is fundamentally different than what it is? And I think that people who argue that post-Second Temple Judaism isn't fundamentally a different religion from pre-Second Temple Judaism, I think that belief is mostly driven by a theological motivation and not a practical or fact-based motivation, where I would argue that they're probably about as different from each other as Christianity is to pre-Second Temple Judaism.
Yes, they're very different. And he's right. They got here because they absorbed a whole bunch of Greco-Romanism in order to appease the Romans. And it's the same thing Christianity did. They absorbed Greco-Romanism to appease Rome.
Maybe a degree, maybe like half as much more different. I mean, but keep in mind, like you didn't have books like the Kabbalah during that period and stuff like that. Like they added a book, we added a book, like things change, things evolve. That doesn't mean that you don't have the right to say we still have a connection to these ancient people. But I think that the structure of the religion is quite different now. But Simone, thoughts before I go further here?
No, that makes sense. But what you're saying, though, is that biblically speaking, there's nothing saying that polygamy is a bad thing. Correct. And it was more of a normative and the civilizational stability development where monogamy came in, which is to say that monogamy is more normative now within religious cultures, not because morally or biblically it is superior, but from a civilizational stability standpoint, it is correlated with more flourishing. That is to say, you're going to have a more stable culture if monogamy is pervasive because you have fewer free radical uncoupled men who are likely
Yeah,
to
and this
cause
is in a lot
violence
of
in
our
society.
research that we talk about is monogamous cultures generally outcompete non-monogamous cultures in a historic context. You have fewer unattached men.
Couple thoughts here that we need to take into account. Number one, we can't do good research of a monogamous culture against a truly polygynous culture, because for centuries, even 1,000 years, but particularly the last 500 years, Greco-Romanism has sought to stamp out or to vilify or to destroy any polygynous culture it comes up against, and the end result is that we have even researchers, when they do this type of research, are going to have monogamy only biased glasses on, and their answers are going to be skewed. We have to go back and simply understand: are Yah's ways higher than man's ways? And if Yah's ways are higher, and he said nothing about it, even gave rules for how to do it righteously, we simply have to accept that. Now, as far as uncoupled men in a culture that allows polygyny, you will have ultimately an equilibrium found where as many men as are capable of marrying will be married, because there will be some women who only want to marry a top tier man, and there'll be plenty of women that'll say, I would prefer to be the only wife, and there are plenty of mid-tier men from which to select, and so I can get a good man. And there'll be plenty of men that aren't qualified to be a husband, don't need to be a husband, don't need to be genetically spreading their seed anywhere. And there are going to be some of those that will choose to be single, and there will be others that decide they're going somewhere else. The point being that man has to be challenged to be a better man. If we have a monogamy only culture, men, because they are always in the minority, you can be a total dirtbag who barely turns oxygen into carbon dioxide and still qualify for a wife. And that is not a good recipe for a healthy society. It's not a good recipe for men to compete and be the best that they can be, right? So I think there's a big problem here with this idea or this understanding that somehow monogamous cultures are superior to polygynous cultures. God didn't have a problem with it. Never did. I don't think he ever will. There's nothing in Scripture that indicates, and he doesn't change. He doesn't have unequal weights and measures. Things aren't different for later on. His law is not going to change. So the whole idea that Western civilization is a superior form of culture over what Scripture has, to me, is moronic. It's unfathomable. The Most High's ways are the best ways. We just have to learn to trust him and walk in them and let things unfold and direct them according to his word, instead of trying to inject other cultures to make it better. That's syncretism. And quite frankly, God hates it.
Which cause civilizational instability because they're basically genetic free radicals that have no reason not to become terrorists or do something else crazy. And you see this, there's been a big study that correlated monogamous versus non-monogamous cultural groups that are otherwise equal. And you saw lots higher rates of lower trust in business transactions in the non-monogamous group. You saw lots of cheating, in more murder. You saw more terrorism. You saw more prostitution. It's just generally not super healthy from a cultural environment. I actually think the Roman system is probably the best, but
I think the Roman system's probably the best. No, God's system's the best. There's no question about it. But see, Christianity in general and Judaism as well both think that the Roman system is better than God's system, which is why they adhere to it. And they adhere to it so that they don't get persecuted by Rome. And Rome did it because they could emasculate men, they could appease men, they could keep a whole lot of what these would call free radicals out of the system, and then they could unify all of that and point it at the enemy. Okay? Again, it's crazy.
Before we get to that, because then you can have, before we get to that, I want to go here with what it actually means that this is in the Bible this way. What it
Okay.
means is if in the future, for some technological development reason, I can't imagine now, we moved into a world where polygyny was the norm, that would not be outright counter-biblical as a way to live. However, the Bible, especially the New Testament, is leaning towards a stronger monogamist interpretation.
Disagree.
And here, I would note how this began to change. Several early church fathers spoke against polygyny, including Justin the Martyr, 160 AD, who rebuked Jews for allowing polygyny. Irenaeus, 180 AD, who condemned Gnostics for practicing polygyny. Tertullian, 207 AD, who explicitly forbade polygamy. And Methodius, 290 AD, who argued polygamy had ended by the time of the prophets.
So why are these early church fathers arguing against polygyny? Is it because it was going on among the Jews and among Christians? Why would they need to address it unless it was actually happening? Oh, because it was part of biblical culture even after the apostles. Yeah, it was part even after the apostles. It was so common that some of these big names have to talk about it. And what they do, you look at every single one of them, none of them are Jewish, none of them have a Hebraic heritage, every single one of them comes straight out of Rome, and like Tertullian, who argues that the Vestal Virgins was a higher ideal. The Vestal Virgins were in pagan temples. And yet this is what the church fathers think is a higher ideal? They loved Greco-Romanism and they wanted to meld Greco-Romanism with Christianity. And he's telling us how they did it.
And then at the Council of Neocrestria in 315 AD, there is reference to a purification period for polygamists, indicating that it was considered sinful at that time. Now, you might wonder, okay, so you have some prophets here, but you don't actually have, like, in any of the Catholic councils, them outright banning polygyny.
Yeah.
Do you know why they never outright banned it, even though it became a cultural norm? Why monogamy?
I imagine it would be hard to find the specific grounds, so you would just be
No, it's because
presumptuously
it made
doing it.
converting people super hard.
Oh, because
because
you'd have
you
to
would-
give up your wife, your extra
Well, no,
wife.
not give up your wives. You have to make a number of women homeless. You no longer look
Oh.
like a good guy if you are coming into a tribe somewhere and you're like, oh, well, the chief has to choose one of his 10 wives and the rest get to be homeless.
And now we know how Christianity destroyed Africa. Because that's what they did do, and many women and children were cast out to become beggars, to become prostitutes, to become homeless, so that the men could be righteous. And this is the case. It's always the case. This is why Christianity won't. They'll talk against polygyny, but they don't talk against adultery. They don't really speak heavily against prostitution. They don't go attack the fact that they don't really preach the need to take care of widows and orphans, because it's incompatible with their monogamy-only position. They then have to come up with a solution, and the only solution, according to Scripture, is allow polygyny.
Yeah.
Like, that's not a super awesome thing to do. And so the way that they would typically do it is they took this softer line interpretation and then they'd say, well, intergenerationally, like, just so you know, like, the Bible doesn't explicitly ban it, but like, it's not super cool with it. Okay.
Oh, so like maybe just don't do that anymore.
Yes. So now let's talk about the decline of polygyny among the Jews. In the Talmud, 4th, 5th century CE, treated monogamous marriage as the norm, though it still discussed polygamy theoretically. And here I would note that while by the time of Jesus, many Jews had come to agree with the Roman view against polygyny, it wasn't officially outlawed. And we only have one Jewish family history from this period. It was found in a cave. And we know from it that there is, on part of it, one additional wife, where one person had 2 wives. So like the
Wow.
only sample we have shows 2 wives. Now, what's very interesting about this incident is the wife came into the marriage with property and an estate. So she wasn't doing it for economic reasons. It might have been for love. It might have been for any number of reasons. It might have been a Levite marriage. We don't know. Okay.
Maybe she was hot for the other wife.
Whoa, getting spicy there.
I mean,
then we have the first outright ban on polygyny for Ashkenazi Jews came around 1000 CE, right?
Rabbi Gershom ben Yehuda issued the ban, or a takanot, on polygyny. Why, if it wasn't the norm and they're only talking about it theoretically in the Talmud 400 years, 500 years before this point, why does he have to issue a ban? That just sounds like, he's just issuing paper on something that means nothing. He's issuing a ruling. It would be like if I issued a ruling on owning crocodiles, right? Or if I issued a rule, here we go. If I issued a ruling on owning brontosauruses, it's moronic. Why issue the ruling on owning brontosauruses? There aren't any. The point is Rabbi Gershom is addressing a current events situation when he issues this ban. So 1,000 years after Yeshua, polygyny is still being practiced among the Jews. 1,000 years. And Rabbi Gershom has to issue a ban.
Rabbi Gershom ben Yoda issued the ban Tanaka on polygyny for Ashkenazi Jews in Germany and France.
Ben Yehuda.
This ban was initially for about 250 years and became an entrenched tradition afterwards. Reasons for the ban included reducing friction with Christian groups, preventing men from taking advantage of wives, avoiding infighting between rival wives, and concerns about properly providing for multiple wives during difficult times of exile.
All of those are addressed in the Torah, and all of those were given righteous solutions for all of it. Instead, Gershom's ban is actually a pragmatic step to try to stave off pogroms against Jews. This is... I'm glad that he's being honest with this here, but notice... Why would you issue a ruling with all of these pieces if it wasn't going on? Oh, because it was.
Isn't that so interesting that Jews ended up banning it not for legalistic, like God reasons, but just this is causing, for kind of the same reason the Mormons did. Like, this is causing unnecessary friction with surrounding Christians.
Yeah, let's just not push it.
It's kind of a pain in the butt anyway.
That's just incredible honesty right there. The real reason Gershom did it wasn't because it wasn't for moral reasons. He did it because he wanted to reduce friction with Christians around him. The Christian culture was largely monogamous because it was Greco-Roman. And so the Ashkenazi ban was largely to prevent pogroms or persecution from Christians that stemmed from them being different. Don't be different. Let's be just like the Greco-Romans. That way we won't get persecuted. Let's negotiate our faith. Now, I did a really good video on this a while back wherein a rabbi talks about this, and ultimately he says that the ban was in order to make sure that God could only have one wife, and it's the Jews and nobody else. So he says that they went on to interpret Gershom's ban as something that could keep Christianity out of the family. And that's a fascinating thought process as well, because God says he has two brides. God says he has the house of Israel and the house of Judah, and he does this at least 6 times in Scripture. I cover 5 of them in a video titled 5 Times God calls himself a polygynist. Yeah. So God says that he's a polygynist, but the rabbis now think that they've got him cornered using Gershom's ban, and that is just utterly laughable. We really cover that well in a different video. I'll put the link down here.
Yeah.
Then for Sephardic Jews, polygyny was never officially banned, but became increasingly uncommon over time. It survived longest among the Yemenite Jews until their immigration to Israel in the 20th century. In 1949, the newly founded state of Israel made polygyny unlawful. Socioeconomic factors also contributed for the decline of polygyny.
So let's see. The Yemenite Jews were still practicing polygyny in 1949, and it took the legal action of the Jewish Knesset of the Jewish Knesset to stop that. Sounds to me like, again, this is all about trying to be like the Romans instead of just simply following what God's law says. And the modern state, in fact, is very much a Greco-Roman influenced state.
It was financially straining to support multiple households. Rabbis and religious leaders generally did not practice polygyny themselves. So yeah, it just basically fell out of fashion over time. So what is your wider thoughts on all of that?
Why did it fall out of fashion? Oh, because we're trying to be like Rome. That's really what this is. Be like Rome.
That apparently it's totally biblically okay, and the only reason we don't do it now is it kind of isn't seen as socially cool, and there are some societal reasons why it's not in the best interest of any particular society or government.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, basically, if you want to do it and you can make it work, go ahead and do it. Just know you're not going to be getting any rewards socially for it in mainstream society.
Great point that she makes right there. It's not against the Bible. It's against societal norms. People typically, even in Christendom, they come with these really weak arguments from what Scripture says. These super weak arguments, and when you really get down to brass tacks, it's because they're uncomfortable with it, and because it's not what we've done the last 500 years in Christianity since the Council of Trent, 1563. So that's brutal honesty right there, and an incredible statement.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess it just states not anti-Abrahamic, and it may be anti-Catholic, for example. Like, different religious subsets have added new rules. You know what's funny here is the Christian group with the most explicit rules against polygyny, biblically speaking, or in their actual like theological literature, might be the Mormons, because they had to ban it, and so they have an explicit ban on it.
Oh my
in
gosh,
liturgy,
how
whereas
ironic.
none of the other Christians do, which is really interesting.
That
So,
is
yeah.
hilarious.
And as to my thoughts on it, and I've talked about this before, specifically as it's framed as polyamory. First, I don't think it ever makes sense to have a relationship where the woman can sleep with multiple partners. That's just stupid. There's no reason for it historically. There's no reason for it evolutionarily, genetically, family-wise. Like, no culture in history has ever done this.
Maybe that's why God says don't do it. That there's no way to trace genetics. There's no way to all of culture and society falls apart with polyandry, which is what he just described.
No, there's one in Tibet.
No, there's the one that was in the mountains where a wife would sometimes marry two brothers.
Yes.
That wasn't a successful cultural group. Like, it almost immediately died out. It's like a weird thing that we know about.
It actually, I think, still goes on in Nepal,
because humans don't do it. Whereas multiple wives is done many times. So what do I think about this in terms of, and I love so many poly people. They're like, oh yeah, like, we're truly poly. And yet, like, when they're rich, I know what they always mean is this one guy and a few girls. And maybe the girls will have some extra girls on the side, but very rarely do I see additional guys in these sorts of relationships. But interestingly, I've seen people try it, and it just hasn't led to polyamory where I've seen it tried over long periods, hasn't been stable. Like, I'm not intrinsically against it. I just haven't seen it stably work. And I think that the Roman system is probably best, where you have
side chicks, the side chick system.
Yeah, you can have side chicks, but you have one wife.
So the Roman system of sexual promiscuity, adultery, or fornication, I guess by the way it's described in Scripture, they say that that's the better system than what God says.
I think that's probably the most stable system. But I
Negative.
don't hate Levite marriages either. Like I see
think
the
what you're missing
morality-
here, though, is that it wasn't. Many of the side chicks in ancient Rome were married. And I think that there are actually advantages to this, where there's kind of this black market thing going on when you have a mostly monogamous society, and yet men have mistresses and women sometimes sleep outside of their marriage.
There may be a black market thing going on, but there's also a black male market going on, wherein, particularly, I think, in the political elite, they want you sleeping around, and they want pictures of you sleeping around so that they can then use it to corral and corner and negotiate or make you operate according to the party line or whatever. I think that's very common, and it may have been going on in Rome as well, though Rome seems to be much more open with promiscuity and who cares, where obviously the scriptures, no, woman's not to sleep around, and a man can have more than one wife. He just has to take responsibility for and covenantally protect and provide for said wife
I think that
or wives.
in some
Well, that's
cases,
going to lead to faster evolution.
it's going to lead to faster evolution. It allows for women, for example, to sleep with more fit partners, for example, more desirable partners, and then have children with them that are raised in the end by other men who've been cucked. But, you know, it still leads to theoretically more desirable traits being passed on to future generations.
Yeah, I mean, a society with a lot of cucking is definitely going to evolve much faster than a society with a small amount of cucking.
So that's an important point. It goes back to, why did God have the system that he had? You're going to have the best quality, highest quality men, whether they marry one or more than one, but they keep and take care of the one or more than one that they take. That's going to be who passes on seed, passes on genetics. And as such, it's going to lead to a much slower, quote, evolution of the genetic line. Where you have the cucking and where you have all of the sleeping around and mixing of seed leads to genetic fragmentation, and it leads to exactly what the adversary desires, and that's to destroy the seed and to destroy humanity.
Yes. Well, and I was just reading some research on trait selection and sort of what we've seen actually play out through history. And it appears to be that the most common form, I'm going to butcher this, I think, is negative selection. In other words, like, bad traits get removed. That's how we evolve. It's not like multiple good traits are selected. It's more that people who have, for some reason, traits that just aren't very competitive are just less likely to see those genes passed on. And in a society that's monogamous, that's only going to happen very efficiently if women are taking on side pieces as well.
Well, and I think that, I mean, you could fix this with polygenic selection. And so I think that polygenic selection, society-wide could be used to prevent a dysgenic spiral. But this is actually one of the things I've talked about is we have created one of the first societies was very, very low cucking because of the really tight child support laws, which mean that, like, me sleeping with somebody else and risking getting them pregnant is really potentially dangerous to me. And so a lot of high value men aren't going to do that, while low value men are still going to do that at a very high rate. And so, that
Well, I want to argue too that women in ancient Rome weren't always sleeping around to get pregnant by other men. There was, I don't know if it was a daughter or sister of Octavian, but there was some letter or something where, like, she had signaled to someone that she knew what she was doing, that she was being careful, and she knew, like, to never set sail unless her ship already had cargo. Yeah, spicy.
Never set sail unless my ship has cargo. That is a great form of birth control. Already being pregnant by your husband.
Yeah. So, she wasn't going to mess up or anything, but she could still have her fun. So
And again, this just demonstrates that God's ways are higher than man's ways. It demonstrates that what God's law says regarding polygyny is righteous and true and better for all of humanity instead of Greco-Romanism, because even in Greco-Romanism, they got the sleeping around, but they have multiple partners, let's put it that way, but they're not doing it in a way that protects genetics. Go back to my video, Why Women Need Sex, right? Another good video that talks about the fact that even if a woman's not getting pregnant, if she's taking in a man's genetic material, it's affecting her person and potentially affecting future progeny. And it can be, the genetic material of various men can be found in a woman's brain, can be found in other parts of her body, because it's living genetic material that's traveling around now in her system. So this the whole Roman thing, Greco-Romanism is more elevated than, or it's a better civilizational model than, what's written, what we find in the Bible. False. It's completely false. And anybody that tells you that it is a complete moron. Okay? And these guys are intelligent, and at the same time, their conclusion comes down to, and ultimately it's because they don't trust Scripture as being from the Most High. Okay? They would claim to be, I think, some form of Christian or some melding of Christianity and Judaism, but they don't act like they truly believe his word. They act like, there are other things that are better, and so therefore we're willing to try them out or test run some other iteration in society. Terrible.
So I'm just going to push back a little bit on the. Now, obviously, it will piss men off immensely for women to cuck them, have kids that aren't genetically theirs, or even sleep around. But there do seem to be, I would say, genetic advantages to it in some cases for like a population on the whole. And it happens. So you just have to admit that.
Simone,
well, sin happens, right? We just have to allow for humans to sin and do it without any sort of public shaming or any sort of societal controls that would control that. And so this is where I would strongly diverge from these guys and say, no, what we need to do is return to what Scripture says and operate according to the biblical model that the Most High gives us.
But I would push back on not selecting for good genes. Like, for example, I don't think that I think I'm unusually maybe intelligent or have unusually good ability to read people, which is a good gene. I don't think I have any bad genes. And yet, I had such an easy time getting people to sleep with me when I was younger. And I had many people actively pursue me. Were we in a society like Rome or something like that, would I be getting lots of people pregnant? Yeah, probably.
You had people who had boyfriends sleep with you. Like, you benefited from this female propensity. Like, what's your argument?
That's the exact argument I'm making, that he's saying that it only removed bad traits, it didn't increase the rate of good traits. But I'm saying that my own background shows that it does potentially increase the rate of good traits.
Okay, fair.
But me not wanting to pay child support, now if I had been in Rome, I probably would have had the exact opposite motivation, because it's frankly more fun when someone can get pregnant, right? And another guy's going to care for it, so what's the problem? That's I've mentioned this in another episode, but I think that men are hard-coded to find it more attractive when they are sleeping with somebody when they know another guy is going to have the kid, because as I noted, on the girls, when I would sleep with another guy's girlfriend, my standards were much, much lower because I found it really hot. And I've noted I'm not the only one. Trump has said the same thing. Trump has said that he prefers to sleep with
I don't know if that's considered the golden standard for...
Well, I'm just saying, if people like Malcolm, you can't admit to this horrible fetish, you'll never get far in Republican politics admitting to that. And I'm like, Trump did it and admitted it. So, apparently that's not true.
He broke so many glass ceilings. So many glass ceilings.
Well, so many glass ceilings. Anyway, love you to death, Simone.
Love you too, gorgeous.
All right, so that brings us to the end of another interesting episode. This is part 2 of Simone and Malcolm talking about how Christians and Jews became monogamous, and they, with everything that they said, ultimately it leads back to a syncretization of an acceptance of Greco-Roman norms and Greco-Roman law into both Christianity and Judaism. In doing so, that's part of the process that both of them went through to become religions and to cease being what Scripture actually says. If you want to know more, if you want to hang out a little bit, or if you want to get to know us a little bit better, and you want to hear from others, maybe see additional research and material, come join us over on Patreon. We'd love to have you. It helps to support us and the work that we're doing, but also it's an opportunity for us to band together and work together on different projects, be able to get to know each other, support each other in terms of how to make wise decisions, particularly as men and women, families understand this information. And it can be jolting, it can be jarring, it can be challenging. So good place to go. Come join us. We'd love to have you over on Patreon. And so like, share, subscribe. I do appreciate when you put this information out to others in the sphere, because we definitely need to spread more of this information. For King and Kingdom, I bid you shalom.